All right, I'll proceed straight to the reading of the Word of God today. That comes from the book of Mark, from chapter 5, from verse 1 to verse 20. It's a long one, so bear with me and just follow through as I'm reading. I'm reading from the New Living Translation, and I'm going to read. So, they arrived at the other side of the lake in the region of Gadarenes. When Jesus climbed out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out from a cemetery to meet him. This man lived among the burial caves and could no longer be restrained even with a chain. Whenever he was put into chains and shackles, as he often was, he snapped the chains from his wrist and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Day and night, he wandered among the burial caves and in the hills, hollowing and cutting himself with sharp stones. Verse 6. When Jesus was still some distance away, the man saw him, ran to meet him, and bowed low before him. With a shake, he screamed, "Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In the name of God, I beg you, do not torture me." For Jesus had already said to the spirit, "Come out of the man, you evil spirit." Then Jesus demanded, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, because there are many of us inside this man." Then the evil spirit begged him again and again not to send them to some distant place. There happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby. "Send us into those pigs," the spirit begged. "Let us enter them." So Jesus gave them permission. The spirit came out of the man and entered the pigs. And the entire herd of about 2,000 pigs plunged down and stepped hillside into the lake and drowned in the water. The herdsmen fled to the nearby town and the surrounding countryside, spreading the news as they ran. People rushed out to see what had happened. A crowd soon gathered around Jesus, and they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons. He was sitting there fully clothed and perfectly sane, and they were all afraid. Verse 16. Then those who had seen what happened told the others and about the demon-possessed man and the pigs. And the crowd began pleading with Jesus to go away and leave them alone. And Jesus was getting into the boat. The man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Verse 19. But Jesus said, "Go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you, and how merciful he has been." Verse 20. So the man started off to visit the 10 towns of that region and began to proclaim the great things Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed at what he told them. And that's the reading of the word today.
A guest speaker, Njonjo is a human rights lawyer and an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. He has previously worked as a head of advocacy for the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights and Africa Deputy Director of the New York-based International Center for Transitional Justice, ICTJ. He chaired the governing council of the Kenya section of the International Commission of Jurists until 2017. Currently, he is a senior advisor to Kenyans for Peace and with Truth and Justice, KPTJ. Njonjo received his law degree at the University of Nairobi and also studied law at Jesus College, University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He is married to Katindi, and they are blessed with 2 daughters. Church, let's put our hands together as we welcome Njonjo. Karibu sana.
Thank you for the introduction, Peter. Peter has said many things about me, and sometimes you get introduced with very many words, kizungu mingi, and you start wondering, are you talking about me or somebody else? But those things are all true. God has blessed me in many ways, in my profession, in my family. Unfortunately, my wife and two beautiful daughters could not accompany me today, and they send their love and apologies. But in addition to being a human rights lawyer, in addition to being an advocate for justice, in addition to being a husband and a father of two beautiful girls, I also live with a mental health condition. And I have lived with a mental health condition for the last 28 years. Since late 1991, early 1992, when I was a master's student at Oxford University, that's the first time I was diagnosed, and I went into a very deep depression. Really, completely debilitating depression. I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. I could not do my assignments. I couldn't get out. I couldn't make decisions. I was wondering what's happening to me. I would go to a supermarket to buy something, and I would stand watching and trying to make a decision between two brands of toothpaste or two types of bread, and I would stand there for 20 minutes, not being able to make that decision. And I had not read up. I didn't know what was going on. But I became so desperate. And when it became untenable for me to continue being in university, because you have to be attending class, you have to be turning in assignments, that became completely impossible. So I left college, I left my room, and I just started wandering the streets, wishing that I could die. I contemplated suicide many times. And at one time, I even went and got many painkillers with the intention of taking them. But thank God I lost my nerve when I thought to take them and just end the pain, because it was very painful. I was out in the streets for almost 4 months in London, in Oxford, and as those of you who've been to the UK know that it rains almost all the time. So I was out. I had a coat, but I did not have a place to go and sleep. I didn't have a place to go and eat. And I would almost starve myself. When I got too hungry, I would buy anything, a piece of cake, whatever, an ice cream, just stuff it down my throat. I didn't have any appetite. And I was completely down and out. And it's just by the grace of God that I am actually still here. I am standing here 28 years later. Because looking back at that season, I could have gone. Eventually, God gave me the presence of mind to come back home. And I came home, and I continued living with my sister in Umoja Estate in Eastlands, but I would wake up in the morning, get out, wander around again like a homeless person, wanting just to disappear. And I did that for another 3 months before eventually I was admitted to hospital. And I was admitted, I was treated for depression, and I recovered. One of the things that was really critical, and I still talk about, is the acceptance of family members. Even though they did not understand what was happening, they were concerned. They accepted me, they loved me, they reassured me that they still were there for me. And that unlike what I thought, that they liked me because I was clever, I had gone to Oxford, they assured me that they loved me for who I was, despite all the trappings of academic success. So I'm here as a testimony. I'm here to talk about mental wellness and mental illness in our society. But when I give statistics about what's happening, I'm not an expert because I'm a lawyer and not a psychiatrist, but I am telling my own story, where I have been, because it's been 28 years, and God has been good. and has continued with the journey of health and the journey of recovery, which is what we all want people to do. And this is important because we need to break the silence on mental health. People don't normally talk about mental health. And in fact, I congratulate Karura for being bold to want to speak about these things among us, because mental health, mental illness is all around us. Mental illness is all around us and is among us. There are those of us here who are also struggling with those difficulties. But what is mental illness? How do we define mental illness to be? And what are the types of mental illness? The National Association of Mental Illness in the US defines mental illness as a medical condition that disrupts a person's thinking, feeling, mood, ability to relate to others, and daily functions. Often, it results in a diminished capacity for coping with the daily demands of life. There are several types of mental illness, including depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, dementia, and so on. Now, my story did not end when I came back to Kenya and was admitted to hospital and treated. I recovered from the depression, and I thought that was the end of the matter. But then I traveled to the States to visit my sister, and when I was there, I got into, it was discovered then that my illness was actually bipolar disorder. And bipolar disorder is a mental illness where it's marked by either deep depression, like what I went through when I was in Oxford, or a very high mood elevation, where you have high energy, lack of sleep, a lot of creative ideas which you can't really follow through. So my final diagnosis, which is what I live with even today, is not depression as such, which is simple depression, is bipolar disorder, which is that moving up and down. And it has to be regulated and managed by medicine and therapy. Let me pause here and say that let's note that mental illness does not mean that you are crazy. Mental illness does not mean that you are crazy. And that's important to say because, or you are out of touch with reality. Actually, 99% of mental illnesses are people who are not out of touch with reality, but their illnesses have to do with their moods. They have mood swings, like I've described bipolar disorder between the highs and the lows, or depression, which is just low. Somebody who's depressed is not crazy or unaware of what's happening around them. They just find it difficult to get out of bed, to manage the routines of every day. So because people think of mentally ill people as crazy, that tends to exacerbate the stigma that makes people even reluctant to come out and seek help when they need to. The second point I'd like to make is that some of the world's greatest leaders suffered from mental illnesses, some of them debilitating mental illnesses. President Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the US, is known to have suffered from deep, deep depression. Winston Churchill talked about the dark plague of the night because he used to suffer from deep depression as well. Martin Luther King Jr., whom you all know, the civil rights leader, suffered from depression and once attempted suicide. Mahatma Gandhi suffered from depression. Ted Turner, who founded CNN, suffers from bipolar disorder. Mother Teresa, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, who we all know, who worked among the poor in Calcutta. When she died, her diaries were discovered, and it was seen that she suffered from great depression during her years of service. So mental illness, it's not craziness. There are people who achieve great things in society despite living with mental illness. And what are the causes of mental illness? A lot of times we live in a society that looks for cause and effect. And so the mental illness does have some causes. In some instances, it's biological or hereditary or genetic. It moves from generation to generation. My own family on my mother's side has a history of depression. My mother used to suffer from what we now know as bipolar disorder. So I've inherited that gene, and it has made me predisposed to mental illness. But there are also other causes, such as environmental. The environment in which you are living can either cause or can be the one that is the spark that leads to mental illness. For me, the spark was living outside of the country for the first time, in my life, but in a country that was cold and dark and gray, and people lived by themselves, and so there was no community. So for me, in addition to being predisposed, there was the environmental factor of where I lived. There are also psychological factors, there are experiential factors. Some people suffer from mental illnesses because they were abused as children. So there are a number of factors that can lead to mental illnesses. But this is not to say that we must always go looking for factors. Because if you look at the Bible in John chapter 9, verse 1 to 3, when the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? And Jesus said, neither this man or his parents sinned, but what has happened to him is so that the name of the Lord can be glorified. So let's not always say, let's look what happened. Did his girlfriend dump him? Because those questions were asked for me when I was unwell. People started saying, oh yes, he was dating this girl and they broke up, and that's why this guy went cuckoos. But there are many issues that are causing the epidemic, because mental health issues are becoming epidemic in our society. We have a breakdown in traditional support systems through the breakdown of the traditional families in our country. That is exacerbating the issue of mental health, the epidemic that we have. Then we have issues of governance. The economy is collapsing. There are no opportunities for young people. There's a general sense of loss of hope for the future. And young people, mental illness a few years ago used to start in the mid-20s to early 30s. But these days studies are showing that it's starting as early as 13 and 14. Young people, very young people, who are worried and wondering, what does my life hold any future or any promise? So those pressures of modern living are causing the kind of mental health epidemic that we have. And because I work on social justice issues, I have to say, the corruption stories that we read every day impact us. When we look at what's happening, people taking public money that's supposed to be for education, for health, for securing our future, the future of young people, when we read all that every day, and the media shows us this every day, at the back of our minds is to say, our society is breaking down, and where is my part in this? So that continues to add the pressure that young people are feeling under, and that is contributing to the mental health crisis. But what is the mental health situation in Kenya? We have some alarming statistics. According to the Ministry of Health and the World Health Organization, 1 in 4 Kenyans, or 11.5 million people, suffer from one or a combination of mental illnesses. 1 in 4 Kenyans. You know, if I asked here to say, let 1 in 4 of us stand, you would be able to see just how much, in terms of representation, how much the crisis is at. And you just need to pick up a newspaper tomorrow or watch the news today, and you find we've got increasing cases of domestic violence, homicide, femicide, the killing of women, either wives or girlfriends, suicide, which have exploded in recent times. And this is partly contributed to by the prevalence of mental illness in our society, unmanaged mental illness, I should say, in our society. In the 10 years between 2008 to 2017, The suicide rate in Kenya rose by 58%. Imagine that, 58%, to reach a high of 421 in that 1 year of 2017. And more than 50% of suicides affect young people between 15 and 29 years of age. In the year 2016, 142,560 people attempted suicide in Kenya in that year alone. So you can see the reason why I'm congratulating Karura for breaking the silence on mental health is that this is a problem we cannot afford to ignore. Our society is falling apart, and in many instances, people want to bury their head in the sand and pretend that it is not happening. It is all around us, and it is amidst us. But how has society responded to this crisis of our time? One of the ways in which society has responded, as I've said, is denial. It's pretending that things are not happening. As long as things seem to be working for me, it doesn't matter what is happening elsewhere. In our society, mental illness is still regarded as a result of curses and incurable, rather than as a medical condition that can be managed. It is seen as a cause for embarrassment for a family because it has failed to produce upright and perfect citizens, which is a lie, because there is no such society in the world or such a family in the world. And so because of this embarrassment and this attitude that the mentally ill are cursed, they are hidden from sight. And there is stigma attached to the illness and isolation of the mentally ill. In some cases, they are locked up in their houses for years. There is some, media every once in a while uncovers a story where somebody has been locked for 18 years in their bedroom. Or in the rural areas, they are chained to trees so that they don't escape and go away. Or in the cities, they are left wandering in the streets, exposed to the elements or abuse. And our society has paid very little attention to the treatment of mental illness. The government only allocates 1% of its budget to mental health. And there are only 92 psychiatrists in Kenya, registered psychiatrists in Kenya, to serve a population of close to 50 million people. And the statistics for the other professionals, psychiatric nurses and psychologists, is equally dismal. And so we have a situation where 5 out of 6 people with mental health conditions in Kenya, only 1 out of 6 people with mental health conditions are receiving treatment. 5 are not receiving treatment. And among the well-to-do, many people with mental health conditions are self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. And that's why, again, the incidence of alcoholism in our society is also reaching epidemic proportions. But how has the church responded? The church's response has not been much more different from the society's. There has been denial and silence. There has been fear, avoidance of the issue, or pretending that it does not exist. Thirdly, there has been a silent condemnation or judgment of those who suffer from mental illness. And that's because people say it must be related to sin. There must be something that you did. And so you are being punished for what you must have done or what your family must have done. And then at best, church tends to apply purely spiritual solutions like prayer and Bible reading, which are without medical intervention, which are inadequate rather, without medical intervention, because mental illnesses are medical conditions. Yes, there may be a spiritual side to it, but there are medical conditions that need to be addressed medically. So when somebody comes to you and all you say is let's pray and let's read the Bible, then that person may not be helped. And if it doesn't work, they end up worse off than they were when they came to you. As Christians, it's surprising that that's how we handle mental illness as the church. And yet when you read the Bible is full of stories of mental illness. You know, if you look at the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 18 and 19, when Elijah had a showdown with the prophets of Baal, and I particularly identify with that story because, for me, he exhibited symptoms of bipolar disorder. On the one hand, he had so much energy, and he called down the fire of God, and the sacrifice was consumed, and he ordered the prophets of Baal to be killed. And then he just got a message from Jezebel in 1 Kings 19, a text, a tweet. Told Jezebel says, may the gods do to me very bad things if by this time tomorrow I do not eliminate you the way you've done to these people. And Elijah panicked. He went, he got depressed, and then he was telling God, I want to die. He was suicidal. And Elijah was so depressed, it took God quite some doing to get him back and recommission him, to remind him who he really was. And he was isolated. He was saying, I'm the only one who's left, although there were 7,000 prophets who had not bowed down. And those are symptoms of mental health. You feel all alone. You feel isolated. You feel this thing is only happening to me. Other examples, we find King David. The Psalms are full of very, very Psalms that show the state of the psalmist. Psalm 42 is one of those that David is just in the doldrums and calling for help from God. The prophet Jeremiah is another example. And many of Jesus' healings are healings of people with mental illness. Although we are told that they had a demon or a spirit, if you look at them from today's modern science, you see that these were people who had mental illness. And so I want to turn in, as I move towards closing this short message, to today's lesson, which is one of those examples where Jesus healed a person who had been mentally ill. This person had so much pain that he had abandoned the living spaces and was living in the tombs, almost wanting to die. And that's what I started by saying. When I was depressed in Oxford, I wanted to die. At some point, I was in a cemetery myself, wishing I could be like the people who had passed on after completing what they had done on earth. And this was what was happening in this region that Jesus and disciples went to. And there are some lessons that we can learn as a church from how Jesus engaged in this situation. And the first lesson is that before the reading that was read to us, when Jesus and his disciples had crossed the lake to the other side, before that, at the end of chapter 4, we have a situation where Jesus and his disciples were in the boat and Jesus was asleep. Remember that story? And there was a storm that threatened to drown all of them. And then the disciples wake Jesus up. And I want to go back there for our first lesson. Jesus had just calmed a terrifying storm. Just like the disciples, we need to understand that we are all in a storm. That yes, there are some of us who are affected more than others by mental illness, but we are all in a storm. Many of us struggle with moods, with anxiety, with wondering how shall I cope with all these modern pressures of modern living. We also need to understand that we are complex beings living in a fallen world, all of us. And sometimes that shows up in mental illness. We are all broken, and that is why Jesus came. We need to understand that mental illness is all around us. And I like a saying that says, you don't have to be mentally ill to suffer from mental illness. You don't have to be mentally ill yourself to suffer from mental illness. You know why? Because when one family member suffers, we all suffer. When one church member suffers, we all suffer. So we are all suffering. Even if you yourself are blessed with good health, good mental health, we are all suffering. And we cannot ignore the suffering in our midst. In a sense, we are all in the same boat. Just like the disciples are all in the same boat. But fortunately, Jesus is still in the business of calming the storm in people's lives through the intervention of his body, the church. The second point, and there are 6 quick lessons that we learn from this story. The second lesson we learn is that Jesus and his disciples had crossed the lake from the comfort and familiarity of Jewish country, where they understood the laws and the customs, to a Gentile territory called Gerasenes. And we know it's Gentile territory because they had pigs there, and the Jews don't keep pigs. So Jesus had crossed with his disciples to that Gentile region of Gerasenes. And in the same way, the church must likewise get out of our comfort zone and confront difficult and complex issues such as mental health. It is not comfortable to talk about it or to deal with it, but we must educate ourselves. We must understand that there are no simple answers. We must be in prayer and encourage those who have mental illnesses among us, just like Jesus and his disciples left their comfort zones. Thirdly, the demon-possessed man came out of the isolation of the tombs and knelt at the feet of Jesus. And he asked, "What do you want with us, Son of God?" Mentally ill people are still asking the church that same question. What do you want with us? And it's a question that we cannot ignore. What do you want with us? What do you want with us? Don't ignore us. We are here among you. We are hurting. Jesus came to reach out and heal those who are sick. And the church cannot ignore that because we are the body of Christ and we represent Christ here on earth. So, our response must be to encourage, to love, to accept, to honor, and to uphold the dignity of those who suffer. And in so doing, we will hopefully remove the stigma. And we will enable them to leave the isolation of the tombs and come into the light of God for healing through Jesus. How we respond will determine whether the mentally ill will continue to reside among the dead in the tombs of isolation and of stigma, or whether they will feel safe enough or welcome enough to come and bow before Jesus the same way that this man did. There's something about Jesus that enabled this man to feel safe enough to come out from where he had been living among the dead. Fourthly, we learn about Jesus. What did Jesus do? Jesus did not fear this man. He engaged him. He treated him compassionately and with dignity, and thereby he healed him. The church must be the hands and feet of Jesus in healing mentally ill people. And we must redefine healing in 2 terms, in 2 ways. One, I've said that mental illness is a medical condition, it's a medical problem. And when I was first diagnosed, and I was a new believer, I was so disappointed that I went to church service after service seeking healing, but none came. So I was very disappointed with God. Why did he not heal me? And we read in the Bible how Jesus healed these people instantly. But the church must help mentally ill people to understand that while God can still choose to heal instantly, as Jesus used to do, he can also, and most often does, choose to use professionals such as psychiatrists and psychologists, as well as medicines, to do his work of healing. For me, my healing, I see it as a daily activity, that every day I'm on medication, and I'll be on medication for the rest of my life. And I wake up and I imagine that it is Jesus who's handing me that pill, because he knows without it I can't function for the day. It is him who's lovingly telling me, go and see your doctor once every 3 months, have a conversation, and see how things are doing. It is him who's sitting on the other side when I'm sitting with my therapist, who's talking to me. It is not, a lot of people avoid modern treatment because they say, Jesus, if he loved me, he would just come and heal me the way he healed this man in the place that he healed. So that's the number one that the church needs to explain to those who are struggling with mental illness. Secondly, there is the other way we need to redefine mental illness to those suffering is to explain to them that mental illness is not necessarily a disease to be cured, but largely a condition that must be managed. Many times I go to take my medication from my chemist, and I run into somebody, and they ask me, oh, sorry, you're sick. I say, no, I'm not sick. I take medication to stop myself from getting sick. Just like diabetes, you take insulin to manage hypertension. There are many conditions that we have that you need to take something, not because you are sick, but to prevent yourself from being sick. If we define it that way, people are more likely to accept treatment and to accept medication because there's still a lot of resistance to treatment. And yet the tragedy with mental health is that accepting and cooperating with treatment is half the battle won. So I explain to people with mental health conditions from my own experience that no, we're not taking medication because we are sick. We are not sick. But we do have a condition that has to be managed. And also to say that, when you break your leg, you have to have a cast. It would be foolish to try and run a marathon with a broken leg. The brain is also an organ that sometimes has issues of chemical imbalances that needs to be managed. So explaining to people that you're not different from a person whose heart is not functioning right, okay? Then the fifth lesson is the lesson we learned from the townspeople. When the townspeople came and they were told what happened, they came in and their first reaction was, what happened to our pigs? The pigs have drowned, and they said they were afraid. Despite the fact that they saw this man sitting down, well-dressed in his normal senses, they did not pay attention to that. They paid attention rather to the economic cost of the healing, the drowning of pigs, and rather than the restored condition of the man. And that is how governments and societies still continue to respond to this crisis of mental health. That's why they allocate only 1% of the national budget, because they're still thinking about pigs. And so the role of the church now must call government and society they must call them out. They must advocate for the necessary attention and resources to be brought to bear upon this crisis of our time. Finally, the final lesson is that once the man was healed, the good news, Jesus' stories always end with good news. He wanted to follow Jesus, but Jesus told him, no, go back among your people. Go back and tell them what has happened to you. And he went and became a great evangelist in the 10 cities of the Decapolis. In the same way, the church and society cannot afford all the wasted potential that those currently afflicted by mental illness. It must intentionally extend its ministry of healing to the suffering so that they can realize their full potential and make their contribution to the extension of the kingdom of God, the same way that this man became a great evangelist in his hometown. So those are the 6 lessons that we learn from this interesting story of Jesus and the man who used to once dwell among the caves and who became a great evangelist. I want to conclude with going back to my own story about living with mental health for the last 28 years, probably most likely for the rest of my life. I continue to function. I continue to do my work. I continue to be a father and a husband to my wife. There are struggles. There are challenges. I have had relapses. I have been admitted to hospital several times, including earlier this year, just before Easter. And over those almost 3 decades, I have lived with this condition, bipolar disorder. It has been 2 decades of taking pills, second-guessing my moods, 2 decades of working in high-pressure situations while ever being cautious not to push myself over the edge, 2 decades of fighting for autonomy while allowing others space to express legitimate concern when they felt I wasn't being myself. In those early days, as I've said, I prayed to God. I prayed that God would heal me, but he would not intervene, at least not in the way I expected. It was frustrating and disheartening, shaking my young faith to the core. Where was this God whom we were told had come to heal us? And where was this Lord by whose stripes we were supposed to have been healed? But now I know that my wholeness is found not in independence from medicines and mood swings, but from learning to make an altar out of my place of brokenness. Out of realizing that in the midst of all his blessings to me, God left something in my life to become a place of my sacrifice, where I can smile through my tears and so be able to declare more authentically that I am a living sacrifice, struggling but acceptable to the God of the brokenhearted. Amen.